August 1943. A single secret letter on General Dwight D. Eisenhower's desk held the power to end the war before D-Day even began. It detailed a brutal act by George Patton, a moment of madness that left the Army's honor in tatters, and a legend on the brink of a court-martial. Was Eisenhower about to sacrifice his best general to save the soul of his soldiers? Or was this the beginning of a catastrophic collapse in command? The dust of Sicily had barely settled when the first tremors of a political earthquake reached Allied forces headquarters at the Hotel Saint-Georges in Algiers. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, usually a master of diplomatic calm, felt the weight of the war pressing against his temples as he read reports from the 15th and 93rd evacuation hospitals. The testimony described scenes that defied military logic. On August 3, 1943, Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. entered a medical tent near Nicosia and encountered Private Charles H. Cool. Cool, shivering from malaria and dysentery with a temperature of 102.2 degrees, admitted he just couldn't take it anymore. Patton's world-famous temper ignited. He called the soldier a coward, struck him across the face with his gloves, and physically kicked him out of the ward. 1 week later, the intensity escalated. At the 93rd Evacuation Hospital, Patton found Private Paul G. Bennett, an artilleryman trembling under severe combat stress, what we now recognize as PTSD. When Bennett mentioned his nerves, Patton's rage became homicidal. He drew his ivory-handled revolver, screamed that the man should be lined up against a wall and shot, and struck him twice, knocking his helmet liner across the room. These were not disciplinary actions. They were the explosions of a commander who viewed psychological injury as an invention of the weak. Eisenhower knew this news was a ticking time bomb. He valued Patton's blood and guts aggression more than any other asset, but he could not defend the indefensible. Eisenhower drafted a personal and secret letter that remains one of the most blistering reprimands in U.S. military history. He stated that while firm measures are sometimes necessary, they do not excuse brutality or the abuse of the sick. Eisenhower informed Patton that his continued command was contingent upon a full public apology to the men he had insulted and to his entire army. This was the ultimatum that nearly ended Patton's career before it reached its peak. Eisenhower was effectively placing Patton on a precipice, warning him that any further exhibition of uncontrollable temper would result in his instant relief and permanent exile from history. Caught in the crossfire was Major General Omar Bradley, the soldier's general. Sent to Sicily to act as Eisenhower's eyes and ears, Bradley initially hid the medical reports in his safe to contain the fire. He understood Patton's duality, the tactical genius who had outpaced the British to Messina versus the man possessed by an archaic, dangerous sense of destiny. Bradley's mission was no longer tactical. It was a desperate attempt at psychological salvage. He had to convince a man who believed himself to be the reincarnation of ancient warriors to swallow his pride and beg for forgiveness from the very men he considered skulkers. Inside the command tents, the tension was lethal. Patton initially viewed the reprimand as a betrayal by the politicians in Algiers, writing in his diary that he was being forced to soft-soap a skulker to placate the timidity of those above. But Bradley spoke with the measured gravity that earned him Eisenhower's absolute trust. He warned Patton that if he did not bend, the story would break, the public would demand his head, and he would be remembered not as a hero, but as the coward who struck a wounded boy. Bradley effectively told Patton he was on the verge of being written out of history. This fear of being forgotten, of becoming a footnote of disgrace, forced the old blood and guts to submit to a humility he had never known. The penance began at the evacuation hospitals. Witness accounts describe a man physically pained by the words he was forced to speak. Patton shook the hands of Cool and Bennett, offering formal apologies. But his private writings revealed a soul still in friction. He still believed they were malingerers. However, the most grueling test was yet to come. Eisenhower demanded Patton apologize to every division in the 7th Army. The 2nd Armored Division, which Patton had once molded, received him with cheers, momentarily restoring his ego. They saw his fire as a sign of the same aggression needed to kill the enemy. That triumph evaporated when he stood before the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red one. These were the veterans of Kasserine and Troina, men who had seen real carnage and had little patience for fake machismo. As Patton's command car arrived, a heavy, oppressive silence fell over the ranks. He began his "Hiya guys" routine, only to be met by a wall of stony indifference. Then the boos began, a chorus of derision that drowned out his speech. Patton, visibly shaken and on the verge of tears, cut the address short and left the stage. He had lost the one thing a general cannot lead without, the respect of his finest infantry. While Patton drowned in disgrace, his primary rival, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, was meticulously capitalizing on the weakness. Montgomery, the Spartan general, was the tactical antithesis of Patton, slow, methodical, and obsessed with balance. During the Sicilian campaign, the rivalry had reached a fever pitch as they raced for Messina. Montgomery used his influence with General Alexander to have the campaign boundaries altered, pushing Patton into a supporting role on the flank, while the British Eighth Army took the primary roads. Patton had defied these orders to take Palermo, but now, with the slaps hanging over him like a shroud, he was on the bench. Montgomery viewed Patton as emotionally unstable and unfit for high command. With Patton relegated to the palace at Palermo, an exile he compared to Napoleon on Elba, Montgomery began to exert more pressure on Eisenhower for a single-thrust strategy. He argued that Patton's outburst proved the American leadership was erratic. Montgomery's methodical approach, prioritizing safety over speed, began to dominate Allied planning, leaving the American generals to fight for their own strategic relevance. Logistics also shifted in Montgomery's favor. As the Allies looked toward Italy, the allocation of fuel and transport became a zero-sum game. Montgomery was a master at lobbying for priority, often making demands that left American units short. Patton could only watch as the initiative he had seized was handed over to a man he called a tired little fart. He seethed with a rage directed no longer at the cowards in hospitals, but at the cousins across the pond who were, in his view, stealing the glory of the American soldier. The psychological toll on Eisenhower was immense. He was managing a transatlantic essay competition of conflicting plans and the constant bickering of prima donnas. Eisenhower wrote to General George C. Marshall, expressing his belief that Patton possessed qualities the Allies cannot afford to lose, but acknowledged his judgment was fundamentally flawed. Eisenhower was walking a tightrope, shielding Patton from a court-martial while preparing Bradley to take command of the First Army for the invasion of Normandy. In the quiet halls of Palermo, Patton spent the remainder of 1943 in dejection. In November, journalist Drew Pearson broke the story of the slapping incidents, sparking a public outcry in the United States. Patton felt sacrificed for political expediency. He worried about the spread of communism and the timidity of Montgomery, believing the war could not be won without his aggression. He was waiting for a miracle to prove that old blood and guts was more than just a headline of disgrace. Eisenhower eventually turned Patton's disgrace into a weapon. Operation Fortitude. Realizing the German high command was terrified of Patton, Eisenhower used him as a phantom. The Germans were convinced the Allies would never invade France without their best general. Patton was placed in command of the fictional First U.S. Army Group in southeast England. This role was psychological torture. Patton oversaw a ghost army of inflatable tanks and fake radio traffic. He made public appearances designed to be leaked to German intelligence, all to support the illusion that the main blow would fall at Pas-de-Calais. While the world prepared for the greatest assault in history, Patton was a prisoner of his reputation, a decoy for the men who had replaced him in the sun. The humiliation of being a phantom general built up a reservoir of frustrated aggression. Patton had learned that his temper was a weapon that could destroy him as easily as it destroyed the enemy. When Eisenhower finally unleashed him with the Third Army in August 1944, it was a different Patton, a man who still swaggered, but one who understood that his survival depended on aligning his ego with the strategic needs of the coalition. The stage was set for the redemption that only a catastrophic crisis like the Battle of the Bulge could provide. By late 1944, the rapid liberation of France had stalled into a static war along the Siegfried Line. Patton's Third Army had roared across the continent, but the momentum ground to a halt in the mud of Lorraine. The logistical strangulation he feared in Sicily was now reality. Eisenhower, following a broad front strategy, had diverted fuel to Montgomery for the ill-fated Operation Market Garden. Patton seethed as his tanks sat bone dry in the cold autumn rain, accusing Eisenhower of placating the British at the expense of American victory. While Allied intelligence remained complacent, Hitler was preparing a massive counteroffensive in the Ardennes forest. He had plucked his most talented panzer leaders, like Hasso von Manteuffel, from the Eastern Front. The goal was to seize Antwerp and split the Allied armies. When the blow fell on December 16, 1944, it struck with the force of a tidal wave, shattering American lines and surrounding the 101st Airborne at Bastogne. The atmosphere at the emergency crisis meeting in Verdun on December 19th was one of grim desperation. Eisenhower asked for only cheerful faces at the table, but the reality was that the American front was breaking. When Eisenhower asked Patton how soon he could pivot his Third Army from Lorraine to a northward counterattack, Patton's answer was instantaneous: the day after tomorrow morning. A wave of disbelief swept the room. To move 250,000 men and thousands of vehicles over 100 miles of icy roads and attack in 48 hours seemed logistically impossible. But Patton was not bluffing. His intelligence staff had predicted the strike, and he had pre-ordered 3 alternative contingency plans. Eisenhower gave the order, "George, I want you to command this move." This was the moment Patton had waited for since the shame of Sicily. Patton's staff coordinated a massive logistical U-turn in the middle of a winter storm. Patton was everywhere, at command posts in the front lines, cajoling, cursing, and inspiring his men. He famously ordered his chaplain to devise a prayer beseeching God for good weather, a gesture of his mystical faith in his own destiny. He believed leadership was the force of will that could overcome even impossible terrain. The conditions in the Ardennes were atrocious. Men huddled in frozen foxholes, sharing body warmth to stay alive. Black ice covered the roads, and fog grounded Allied air power. But Patton's 4th Armored Division pushed with relentless energy. They fought through darkness and bitter German resistance, slogging through a meat grinder that more cautious commanders feared. The relief of Bastogne on December 26, 1944, was the tactical climax. The 101st Airborne, led by General Anthony McAuliffe's defiant Nuts, had held the crossroads against overwhelming odds. Patton's tanks broke the siege and turned the tide. The miracle occurred. The weather cleared on December 23rd, allowing Allied air power to return and devastate the German columns. The rivalry with Montgomery intensified during the crisis. Montgomery had been given temporary command of the American northern flank, a move that infuriated Patton and Bradley. Patton viewed Montgomery as trying to steal the show with Eisenhower's help. The race was on to reach Houffalize. Patton's men beat the British to the town on January 16, 1945, closing the Bulge. The Battle of the Bulge was Patton's finest hour. He emerged with his reputation restored and enhanced. He had demonstrated operational maturity and meticulous planning that few believed he possessed after Sicily. He proved that his aggression was the right solution to an existential problem. Eisenhower's decision to keep him on the team was vindicated by the reality of the battlefield. After the Bulge, Patton's Third Army surged across the Rhine on March 24th, 1945. He urged Eisenhower to let him go all the way to Berlin, believing the Allies should seize the capital before the Soviets. He detested the Russians, viewing them as a future threat to Western civilization. But political factors took over. The Allied lines were halted, leaving Patton dejected as the war in Europe ended. The final fall of George Patton began in the post-war occupation. As military governor of Bavaria, his lack of political tact became a liability Eisenhower could no longer tolerate. Patton's inflammatory remarks comparing Nazis to American political parties sparked a new firestorm. Eisenhower, who was now being bitten by the presidential bug, saw little point in keeping Patton in power. In October 1945, Eisenhower finally relieved Patton from the Third Army. It was the end of an era. Patton was transferred to the 15th Army, a unit tasked with documenting the war's history. Patton arrived feeling a deep hurt and anger, convinced Eisenhower had sacrificed him for political expediency. He spent his final weeks castigating his tormentors in his diary and writing his memoirs, War as I Knew It. The tragic irony was that the man who survived the greatest tank battles died in a mundane car accident. In December 1945, a collision near Mannheim left him with severe spinal injuries. He died on December 21st, 1945. He was buried in Luxembourg among the men of his Third Army who fell during the Battle of the Bulge. The relationship between Eisenhower and Patton remains a compelling study in leadership. It was a partnership of opposites, the diplomat versus the warrior. Eisenhower's ability to handle Patton, to discipline him without destroying him, and to unleash him at the moment of greatest peril is a testament to the Supreme Commander's own strategic brilliance. Ultimately, a single decision behind closed doors changed the course of a world war. Patton was nearly written out of history, but he clawed his way back to become its most unforgettable protagonist. The question remains, was Patton's aggression a necessary evil of total war? Or was he a relic of a past that the modern world had to outgrow to survive? In your opinion, was Eisenhower right to save Patton despite his actions in Sicily? Or did the old blood and guts philosophy cost the American army more than it gained? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.